Thank you, Chip. Well, it's a real pleasure to be with you again today and to share with you some of the great finds from archaeology. Let me just mention again our sign-up sheet on the clipboard up front here. If you would like to receive our monthly newsletter, just put your email address on that and I'll see that you receive that. It comes out once a month. Well, this morning we're going to talk about the site of Jericho. Jericho being very famous, of course, because it's the place where the walls fell down. We read about that in Joshua chapter 6. This, of course, being the first city that the Israelites attacked as they came into the promised land. Not working for you?
Oh, your microphone.
Okay. All right, we're going to back up and reset here. Mic wasn't working quite right. That's my fault. I didn't put it on right. I apologize. Okay. We're going to be talking this morning about the city of Jericho, located in the southern Jordan Valley. And it was the first city the Israelites attacked when they came into the promised land under Joshua after wandering 40 years in the wilderness. Jericho has been a controversial site in biblical archaeology. A number of different expeditions have gone there over the years, and each one seemed to have had a different conclusion concerning the connection between their findings there and the Bible. In the 1930s, there was a British archaeologist who worked there named John Garstang. He found a great thick destruction debris at the site. He said that was done by the Israelites because the Bible says the Israelites burned Jericho. And he dated the destruction to about 1400 BC. And that is the biblical date for the conquest. Well, this was wonderful. Here we had archaeology that agreed with the Bible. But then in the 1950s, another British archaeologist came to Jericho. Her name was Kathleen Kenyon. And she completely revised Garstang's findings. She said Garstang was wrong in his dating and that the city was really destroyed in 1550 BC, some 150 years before Joshua. And she said at the time of Joshua, there was no city there to be conquered. And this is what you'll read in the history books today and the books on archaeology in the Bible. Well, let's take a look and look at the evidence. And the reason I've gotten involved in this whole sort of debate, although there's really no debate nowadays, everyone accepts Kenyon's dating, but in this so-called discrepancy between archaeology and the Bible, the reason I got involved in this is because my specialty is Canaanite pottery from the late Bronze Age. And the late Bronze Age is the time of the Exodus and the conquest. So I got involved in looking at the excavation reports from both of these expeditions. And in fact, there was an earlier expedition at the beginning of the 20th century, and I looked at their pottery as well. And based on my analysis of all of the finds, I believe Garstang had the date right in the 1930s, and Kenyon, in fact, was wrong. So we're going to look at some of this evidence and look at some of the evidence that shows dramatically that what we read in the Bible really happened at Jericho some 3,400 years ago. What I've put up on the screen here is a typical comment by a scholar concerning the archaeology of Jericho. This particular man, H.J. Franken, worked with Kathleen Kenyon at the site in the 1950s. And he says the archaeological evidence leaves no option but to accept that there was no LB, that is late bronze, city of Jericho around 1400 or even 1200. Some scholars say that the conquest was some 200 years later than the 1400 date. The 1400 date we derive from biblical chronology and really is the correct date. So there was no LB city at the time of the conquest, no matter when you would like to date it, on or around Ain es Sultan, that's the Arabic name of the Tell of Jericho. That is the huge ruins of the Hyksos, or Canaanite city. Those huge ruins gave rise to the folk tale attached to the hero Joshua. So he's saying that what we have in the Bible is nothing more than a folk tale. Jericho is located near the Dead Sea here in the southern Jordan Valley. And as the Israelites were coming on the east side of the Dead Sea, they camped here on the plains of Moab, crossed the Jordan River, attacked Jericho. That gave them a foothold in the land. And then they proceeded up into the hill country, attacked the site of Ai, then had a southern campaign here in the southern areas of the highlands, and then went all the way up to the north and fought a battle with a coalition of kings at Hatzor. When we read about the crossing of the Jordan River, we see God performing a miracle. This is recorded in Joshua chapter 3, verses 15 and 16. And this kind of adds to this idea that this is a myth, a folk story, when skeptical scholars read this in the Bible, how the Jordan River stopped flowing. Now, doesn't that sound like a myth, like some kind of a folk story? Well, let's look at it a little bit here. We're told that when those who carried the ark came to the Jordan, and the feet of the priests carrying the ark were dipped in the edge of the water, for the Jordan overflows all its banks all the days of harvest. So it's telling us here that it was harvest time when the Israelites crossed the Jordan River. It was in flood stage at that time, and harvest time here in the southern Jordan Valley is in the spring of the year. So this took place in the springtime, and we can be very precise about the date. I've been using a kind of a round number of 1400, but based on our biblical chronology, we can be very precise and say that the year was actually 1406 BC, so we can narrow it right down to the spring of the year, 1406 BC, when they crossed the Jordan River. And we're told that the waters, which were flowing down from above, stood and rose up in one heap a great distance away at Adam. And that is just north of Jericho, some 15 miles, so that the waters did not flow down to the Sea of Arabah, which is the Dead Sea, also called the Salt Sea. They were completely cut off. So the people crossed opposite Jericho. Here's a picture of what the Jordan River looks like in flood stage. This was back in 1940. We don't see this today because the water of the Jordan has been reduced pretty much just to a trickle down at this southern area before it flows into the Dead Sea, because both the Jordanians and the Israelis are using the water from the Jordan River to irrigate their agricultural fields up and down the Jordan Valley. But in the days of Joshua, it would have looked like that, and it would have been really impossible for the thousands of Israelites and all of their animals to cross that flooded river without a miracle from God. Here's Adam, 15 miles north of Jericho, where the waters were dammed up. We read in the Bible, Joshua chapter 3. Well, when we go up to that area, we see that the Jordan River flows very close to high embankments in several places there. And in recorded history, we discover that when an earthquake strikes in the Jordan Valley, and that is fairly frequent because it's part of the rift system, it's very unstable in the Jordan Valley, and they get a good strong earthquake about once a century there in Israel in this area. And when an earthquake strikes just right, it will actually dislodge the embankments near the Jordan River and cause those embankments to fall down, collapse, and actually dam up the river. And the most recent occurrence of that was in modern times. In 1927, There was a very strong earthquake in Israel, did a lot of damage all across the country. And here at Adam, the Jordan River was dammed up, and the waters of the Jordan did not flow for 20 hours. It's a well-documented event. And so I believe God used an earthquake to bring that about at just the right time as the Israelites were crossing the Jordan River. So it's not a folk tale. This is reality. And it's happened in history. But in this case, of course, God was in control and directing events. Here we see a ground view, and you can see how high those embankments are and how easy it would be when an earthquake comes and just loosens that earth, how easily it could collapse into the Jordan River and dam it up. Well, here's a view of Jericho from the west. We're looking out toward the Jordan River here. The Israelites would have been approaching from the east, coming toward us in this picture. And the ruins are right here in the middle. They're not terribly impressive when you look at them, just kind of piles of dirt there. But there's thousands of years of civilization buried under the mounds of Jericho. It's one of the oldest cities in the world. The reason there was a city there from the very earliest times of civilization is because of a very strong spring that's at the southeast corner of the ruin. And that spring is still flowing today. In fact, it provides water for the modern town of Jericho. Jericho is actually an oasis. When you get beyond the little town there, it's all desert in the lower Jordan Valley. And it's only because of the spring that's there that we have a town there, and agriculture can be undertaken and so on. You can see many palm trees there, and another name for Jericho in the Old Testament is the City of Palms. This is a reconstruction of Jericho based on John Garstang's work in the 1930s, and in this view we're looking to the west, and you can see just beyond Jericho there the hills of Judah, and that highest mountain there behind the city is the traditional Mount of Temptation. I don't know if it is the real Mount of Temptation or not, but the mountains that you see there enter into the story. If you remember when the spies went into Rahab's house and she hid them, and then they escaped out the window of her house, she told them, "Flee to the mountains." And here we see those mountains that Rahab was talking about. Well, let's look at the walls of Jericho. Garstang believed that there was one city wall up here at the crest of an embankment that surrounded the city. He shows another wall down here at the bottom of that embankment. We see the retaining wall here and a mud brick wall built on top of that. But he believed that had gone out of use and it was in ruins as he shows it in this picture. Kathleen Kenyon, on the other hand, when she excavated in the 1950s, determined that that was not the case, that this was all part of one system built at one time, and there was an upper wall and a lower wall with this earthen embankment. Now, Kathleen Kenyon dated, as I said, the demise of the city 150 years before the Israelites came into the land, but once we understand the dating and correct her dating, then we realize that this is the fortification system that was there in 1400 BC when the Israelites attacked the city. So we'll take a closer look at that fortification system in a minute. Here's John Garstang, the man who dug there in the 1930s. He wasn't an evangelical believer, but he did have a high view of the history of the Bible and its accuracy, and so he tried to correlate his findings with the biblical record because he believed that it was describing real history. Kathleen Kenyon, she claimed to be a Christian actually, belonged to the Church of England, but had rather liberal views, and if her findings didn't line up with the Bible, that didn't particularly bother her. Her father was a very famous biblical scholar. In fact, Sir Frederick Kenyon was the director of the British Museum, and he helped his daughter on her path to becoming a famous archaeologist. He wrote a very good book comparing archaeological findings with the Bible, and he was, I think, a stronger believer than his daughter Kathleen. Here's a plan of Jericho, and we can see the various areas excavated by the different expeditions that came there over the years. Jericho is the second most excavated city in Israel, the first, of course, being Jerusalem. So we see here in blue the areas excavated by the Germans between 1907 and 1909. Notice that they uncovered that lower wall that we looked at, and we're able to trace that around most of the tell. But on the eastern side, it's all gone because they built a road over on that side, and they excavated away the eastern part of the site. So we can't trace the wall on that site. The spring is right here, and you can see that the wall would have enclosed the spring. So that would have been inside the city wall. That's very important because in time of siege, you want to have a good supply of water, a safe supply of water, and they had it there at Jericho. So they could have withheld there and withstood a long, long siege. Then the red, well, let me point out one other area before we leave the German excavations. We're going to look at some finds up here at the northern end of the site a bit later on. Otherwise, their finds there don't really relate to the story there in the book of Joshua. In red, we see the areas excavated by John Garstang, and we're going to look in particular at this area on the southeast slope of the tell, and that's where he found the evidence for the destruction of the final Bronze Age city. Everywhere else, and you can see they excavated many other areas on the tell, everywhere else that phase had been eroded away, washed away. So the only evidence we have for the destruction described in the Bible is here on that southeast side of the site. And then Kenyon opened up some areas just north of that and found the same thing that Garstang had found. So we're going to look at those two areas. Then we're going to look at Kenyon's West Trench here and see what she found there. And also we'll have a look at some recent work down at the southern end of the tell right there where they've exposed that outer retaining wall of the earthen embankment. This is an aerial view of Jericho looking south, and all of the trenches and excavation squares you see there are the work of Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s. You see nothing of Garstang's work when you visit the site today. Here we see John Garstang photographing pottery that he found in a tomb not far from the site of the city, a couple of kilometers away. And there he found a cemetery. He excavated a number of the tombs in the cemetery, and they provided valuable information for him that allowed him to date the destruction level up on the tell. Because in this burial, this one and another one nearby, he found what we call scarabs. These are small amulets. Scarab means beetle. I think it's French. And these amulets are shaped like a beetle. They have a flat bottom, kind of a rounded top. And then on that flat bottom, they would inscribe a person's name or just some kind of a pictorial representation or some geometric motif or something like that. He found a number of these scarabs that had on the bottom names of Egyptian pharaohs. Of course, we can date the pharaohs through Egyptian history, and so this gave him datable material. The pottery found in association with those scarabs, he was able to date to the time period of the 15th century BC, the time just before the conquest. So this allowed him then, when he found that same kind of pottery on the tell, to date the destruction to about 1400 BC. Here are some examples of those scarabs. Hatshepsut, that she's a very famous queen of Egypt, and her scarab is quite rare, and so it's not a family heirloom that would have been held onto for hundreds of years. It's contemporary with the material that Garstang found it with there in the cemetery. Thutmose III, the next pharaoh, ruling right up until a few years before the exodus from Egypt. And then we have Amenhotep III ruling around 1400 or maybe even the early 1300s BC. And here we see those scarabs, the actual scarabs. I believe these are in the Louvre in Paris, and there's some more in the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem. Here we see some of the pottery from the destruction level. On the left is pottery from Garstang's dig, and you'll notice it's painted with black and red paint, and this is very distinctive pottery. It was in use only in the second half of the 15th century BC. In other words, from about 1450 down to about 1400 BC. And this pottery alone will give us a date of about 1400 for the destruction of Jericho. Garstang found a lot more pottery, but this would be, I would say, the most important pottery that he found in that destruction level. On the right, pottery from Kenyon's excavation. Again, pottery from that same time period. In fact, you can see that these bowls here, we have drawings in this case, and over here we have the actual pots, but you can see that these bowls have circles, concentric circles painted on the inside of the bowl, and that's exactly what these are. These are sherds or pieces of that same kind of a bowl with these concentric circles inside. This is a marker for what we call the Late Bronze I period, that time period from about 1500 down to 1400 BC. So those bowls and other pottery pieces here all come from that Late Bronze I period. Cooking pots and dipper juglet and lamp and so on. All of this is typical Late Bronze I. So you might ask, well, why didn't Kenyon recognize that? The fact of the matter is, she did not study the pottery that she excavated. Now that may seem strange, but that's the fact of the matter. She was looking for exotic imported pottery, beautifully painted pottery that was brought into Canaan from Cyprus. Cypriot pottery. It was painted similar to this pottery on the left, in black and red. And in fact, some of this is imitation of that more expensive pottery from Cyprus. And so she was looking for this imported Cypriot bichrome ware, we call it. And she did not see any of that as she excavated that destruction level. And so she concluded that nobody was living there at the time because she didn't see this exotic imported pottery. Well, she and Garstang both were digging in a poor part of town. So you wouldn't expect to find this expensive type of pottery. And Kenyon, in her own writing, said this was a very poor part of town. And so she didn't even bother analyzing the common, everyday Canaanite pottery that was in that destruction level. And that's been sort of my role in this whole debate about Jericho, is to do that analysis, and I'm working on that publication now. So the pottery tells us without any question that Garstang was correct in his dating and that Kenyon was wrong. The destruction took place in about 1400 BC, and now we can turn our attention to the archaeological finds to see if they correlate with the Bible at all. What about those famous walls of Jericho? Here's a signpost pointing the way to Tel Sutan and the old walls of Jericho. Are they there today? And here's an artist's view of those walls coming down. Well, we've talked about this complex fortification system they had there, at Jericho with the earthen embankment here, a wall at the top of the embankment, then another wall down here at the base. This would have been the upper city within the upper wall up on top of the tell, and that occupied about 6 acres. It wasn't a large place. Only a few thousand people would have been there when the Israelites attacked it. And if you take into account the embankment as well, it's still only about 9 acres. And as we'll see later, there were people actually living on the embankment. Here's a cross-section through that fortification system. The purple, blue here, showing the embankment. Today it's preserved only up to about this height. The rest of it all eroded away. Then there's our brick wall at the top of that embankment, about 6 feet wide, and we know there was a wall there from an earlier phase of this fortification, and Kenyon uncovered that earlier phase, and it had a wall up there about 6 feet wide. And down here we actually have found portions of this lower wall at several places around the tell, and we know it was about 6 feet wide. That means the height of the wall would have been around 20 feet, approximately 3 times as high as it was wide. And then finally we have this stone retaining wall here, goes right down to bedrock, and that held this embankment in place. And here is ground level, and this is where the Israelites were walking around the city each day for 7 days. And you can imagine the thoughts going through their heads as they were looking up at this massive fortification system and thinking, wow, how can we ever take this city? But yet they followed the Lord's direction and they marched around it one time each day for 6 days, and then on the 7th day they marched around 7 times, and then those walls came down. Here's the description of the walls falling down as we have it in Joshua chapter 6, verse 20. And it tells us the people shouted, the priests blew the trumpets, and when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down flat. That's what all of our translations say, the wall fell flat. But when you look at the Hebrew text, there's a Hebrew word used there that does not mean flat, but rather means the wall fell beneath itself. Well, you saw that cross-section diagram. When those walls fell, what would happen? The mud bricks would just tumble down that embankment and be deposited at the base of that retaining wall. And so literally, the walls fell beneath themselves. Now it's interesting that critical scholars will tell us that this story was written hundreds of years later. In fact, most biblical scholars say the Old Testament was written during the exile period. Well, when we look at something like this, we must wonder, well, how would they know in the exile period that the walls fell beneath themselves? Obviously, they would not know, and obviously it wasn't written then. It was written by someone who observed the walls falling down. It's an eyewitness account, and that is what our Scripture is. It's something that was written at the time. It's not something written down hundreds or thousands of years later. Then we read the people. These are the Israelite soldiers around the city on that 7th trip around, that 7th day. They went up into the city. Well, here again, how would a later writer know they went up? Why didn't they just run straight in? Well, again, the person who wrote this down was observing what happened, and they had to go up over that earthen embankment to get up to the city. Every man went up straight ahead, and they took the city. Just another artist's reconstruction of those events. Down at the southern end of the site of Jericho, there's been a recent expedition in the late 1990s undertaken by a team from the University of Rome. and they cleared quite a long section of the retaining wall. Kenyon had previously dug a trench up to that wall, but she did not go beyond the wall to the area outside of that retaining wall. And so the Italians, as part of their work, cleared a section of the wall, and as you can see, it's very high. I am standing at about the level of ground level at the time of Joshua, and so you can see just this stone facing, this retaining wall, is a huge barrier for the Israelites to get into the city. It's how high? 18 or 20 feet. And then on top of that, of course, the mud brick wall. This is a view kind of looking down on that, and you can get such a view because there is now a cable car that goes from the parking lot at the southern end of the Tell of Jericho up to the Mount of Temptation, where there's a monastery up there kind of clinging to the cliff. So this cable car will take you up if you want to visit that monastery, but it passes right over that Italian excavation area, and you can see the length of their dig there where they've exposed this retaining wall for that distance there. And notice buildings here outside of the wall. Excuse me. And when they constructed this wall, they cut through the buildings that were there right along this line. You can clearly see the cut when they dug a trench down to bedrock, and then they built their stone retaining wall from bedrock up to support that earthen embankment. Well, this is important archaeology here because we know the sequence. First, we have these buildings, and then after that, after they went out of use, we have the construction of this massive wall. The pottery in the buildings here dates to the very end of the Middle Bronze period or very early in the Late Bronze period. In other words, right around 1500 BC. So again, this is disproving Kenyon's date of some 50 years earlier for the destruction of the city. They were just building their final fortification system around 1500. Which means the destruction happened sometime after that, and from the pottery it would be about 100 years later than the construction of the fortification system. So that is very important evidence that the Italians have provided for us. Here's a view at the end of Kenyon's West Trench that she dug through the fortification system, and before she cut through this retaining wall, she cleared it off and took this nice picture, and then she completed the trench and cut right through that retaining wall. But we can see again the great height of that wall. The meter stick there is what, 1, 2, 3, 4 meters high, and so you can kind of calculate the overall height. Maybe that's 2 meters. It's hard to tell from the picture. Anyway, the important thing I wanted to show you here are the remnants of the mud bricks up here. It's the first course of the mud brick wall that once stood there, and that's the wall that fell. When the Italians first exposed that retaining wall, there were chunks of mud brick on top of their wall as well, and here I'm putting my hand right on those mud bricks. But this was taken, I think, 1997. Since then, the winter rains have washed these bricks away, and they're not there today, unfortunately, but they were there when they first opened up that area. Here's a cross-section through Kenyon's West Trench, what we call a bulk drawing, and it gives us the details, again, of that fortification system with the yellow showing our earthen embankment. Here's our retaining wall. Here's ground level. And notice what Kenyon discovered when she dug beyond that retaining wall, a great pile of what she calls fallen red bricks. Isn't that interesting? A pile of fallen red bricks. And what does she say about it? In her excavation report, she tells us the first tip line, that's this sloping surface here, was fallen red bricks piling nearly to the top of the revetment. That's what she calls this retaining wall. And you can see the bricks go nearly to the top of that retaining wall. These probably came from the wall on the summit. She's talking about the mud brick wall up there, summit of the bank, or the brickwork above the revetment. Well, isn't this interesting? She is saying that that pile of bricks came from the city walls. That's where the bricks were deposited when the walls fell down. Now, for Kenyon, it had nothing to do with the biblical account because of her incorrect dating. For her, this happened 150 years before Joshua, but once we get the dating straightened out and we know that the city was destroyed in about 1400, then we realize this is evidence for the fallen walls of Jericho. And this isn't the only example. Every place around that tell where archaeologists have dug, they have found a similar pile of bricks. Let me just go back and make one more point before we leave that section view there. Okay, the walls fell down. How were the Israelites going to get up over this retaining wall, which was very high? Well, notice how those bricks fell in such a way as to form a ramp. And so when the walls fell, the Israelites could just scramble over that pile of collapsed mud brick and go up into the city, just as the Bible tells us. I'm here at the base of the retaining wall, and in the bulk of the Italian dig, you can clearly see the same pile of bricks piling up against the retaining wall as Kenyon found just a short distance away in her west trench. Everything at the base of that retaining wall is all collapsed mud brick. I've got my left foot there on some of that mud brick. Chip is going to go to Israel in August, and he's going to jump down in that trench, and he's going to bring us back one of those bricks. Right, Chip? You bet. Okay, the evidence is still there today. And this just shows some of the places around the city where they have excavated up against that retaining wall and found similar evidence. Well, if the walls fell down, what about Rahab's house? We mentioned the spies going into her house, and when she hid them and the king's men left, then we're told that she let them down by a rope through the window, for her house was on the city wall, so that she was living on the wall. Now, other translations might have something slightly different. Maybe her house was in the wall or a corner of the wall or something like that. In fact, the translators really don't know how to deal with the Hebrew that we have here. But now that we have the results of the excavations, we can more precisely translate the Hebrew here. The Hebrew actually says that her house was built against the vertical surface of the city wall. Bakir ha-homa. Homa is the word for the big city wall. Kir is a word that usually means small wall, but in this case it means the vertical surface of a wall, and that's a meaning that we encounter sometimes in the Old Testament. And so her house was bakir, against the vertical surface of the Homa, the city wall. And so the city wall was actually kind of the back wall to her house, and she had an opening there to let in some light and fresh air. And so by letting the spies out that window of her house, they were able to go down over the city wall. And then she said, "Flee to the mountains," and that was quite close by. And then later, the Israelite spies went back to her house and rescued Rahab and her family. You remember they had made that covenant. If she would hide them and hide them from the king's men and save their lives, they would save her life when they attacked the city. And they said, "Put a red rope out this window of your house so that we will know which house is yours." Well, if the city wall fell, how did her house survive? Well, archaeology gives us the answer. Up at the northern end of the site, all of the expeditions excavated trenches through that fortification system, and they found that the wall was still standing at the northern end of the site. The Germans here found it still standing to a height of about 9 feet. Can you imagine, after 3,400 years, still standing to a height of 9 feet. Garstang found a similar situation, maybe not quite as high as the Germans, but still quite high. And Kenyon found just a bit of it here, but enough to show that it was still kind of still remaining there to some extent. The wall did not fall. That is what we're determining from these remnants that are remaining there. Here's Garstang's dig, and we see again our retaining wall here, and then here's what's left of that brick wall. It's 6 feet wide, and my goodness, it looks like it's even higher than 6 feet. But it shows that in the northern part of the tell, the wall did not fall for a short distance. Here's a plan looking down on the findings from the German dig with our retaining wall running here and our mud brick wall running along here. And we see that houses are built on the slope right up against the lower mud brick wall. So this must be the area where Rahab's house was located. I don't know which one is hers. We don't know her address, and so we weren't able to figure out which house she lived in. But it must have been one of these houses on the north side of the tell, and of course the north side is the closest side to those mountains, and the spies could easily escape from there to the mountains. So that explains how Rahab's house was able to survive, because God preserved it, and He preserved the wall there on the northern side for that short distance. Here again we can see our retaining wall, and then here's the mud brick wall. This is from the German dig, and notice all of the houses there on the embankment. This must have been the poor part of town, excuse me, sort of the overflow from the upper city, and this is apparently where Rahab lived. Here's an artist's reconstruction of that. The houses were much more tightly packed than what he shows here, but it gives you an idea of the situation there and where Rahab's house was located. And her house would have looked something like this, with the flax drying on the roof, the hole or the opening there where the spies escaped. Today you can still walk around the site of Jericho, and every little ways you can see the top of that stone retaining wall kind of popping up through the earth. And if you care to walk around, it takes about a half an hour to go around the site of ancient Jericho. Well, now we're going to go over to the southeast slope where they found the evidence for the burned city. The area here to the south was dug by Garstang. You can see he dug a very large area, uncovered many mud brick houses. And then this is the area dug by Kenyon, and she found exactly the same thing, a great thick burn layer about a meter or 3 feet thick. This is a picture of Garstang's dig there and all the buildings he uncovered. When you go to Jericho today, you come up this pathway here, and you go up this little kiosk, and as you're walking through here, you're actually walking through Garstang's excavation area, and you can see there's nothing left there. It's all been dug away. When you get up to this kiosk, however, right in front of it are Kenyon squares, and you can look into those squares, and if you know where to look, you can see the evidence for the burning and the destruction. This is another bulk drawing, this one from those squares there that are right in front of the kiosk. And if you look in those squares, you can see part of a cobbled street over here, walls of the final Canaanite city that was destroyed, floor levels, and so on. Notice how the walls are tipped. Kenyon said that was due to earthquake activity. Garstang said he found much evidence for earthquake activity, and so I believe God used an earthquake to bring the walls down as well as dam up the Jordan River. But again, the timing was just right, and he did it in such a way as to protect Rahab's house. You can see there the thick destruction level shown in red of the tremendous fire that destroyed the city. Then it was abandoned for some period of time, and that is indicated by this yellow erosional layer formed by material washing down from further up the tell and being deposited there. And then we have another occupational period. There were some buildings built on top of that erosional level. And this relates to Judges chapter 3, when we're told that Eglon, king of Moab, came to the city of palms and built a palace there and then collected tribute from the Israelites. Well, Kenyon only found some bits and pieces of that face, some outbuildings of that palace, but Garstang actually found that palace and excavated the whole building. Now, that's another story, but it verifies this account in the Bible as well. And then after that, just totally abandoned, no more occupation, and this is just the debris and so on top. And so we see here the evidence for the burning as described in the Bible. Here is that description that we've already read, how the people went up into the city when the walls fell. And then we read in Joshua 6:24, they burned the city with fire and all that was in it. And that's exactly what the archaeologists found. Here's Kenyon's description of that destruction. She says it was complete. Walls and floors were blackened or reddened by fire. Every room was filled with fallen bricks, timbers, household utensils. In most of the rooms, the fallen debris was heavily burnt, but the collapse of the walls of the eastern rooms seems to have taken place before they were affected by the fire. Now, this is very significant because she is saying the sequence that she sees taking place there was first an earthquake bringing the walls down, and she's talking about the walls in the city now, the houses and buildings there collapsed, and then the fire. Earthquake and fire, or let's say fallen walls and fire, and that's exactly what we read in the Bible. First the city walls fell, and then the Israelites stormed the city, and they set it on fire. So archaeology verifies this small detail that we have in the Bible. And here's a photo of that balk, that side of her excavation square in front of the kiosk. Here we see the cobbled street that she excavated, one of those leaning walls here. And above that, all of this is destruction debris and the burn level. In all of the buildings, both Garstang and Kenyon found big storage jars full of grain. This is from Garstang's dig. Kenyon found the same thing. Here's her excavation area, and just to the left in one of the rooms she found again these large storage jars full of grain. And this is very significant because it gives evidence to the fact that the city was not plundered. Why wasn't the city plundered? Because God commanded the Israelites to offer up Jericho as an offering of the first fruits of the promised land. So they were not to take anything from the city of Jericho. And the grain was left. Grain was very valuable. Normally it would be taken. You could use it for food, of course, but if you had an abundance of it, you could use it to barter. It was like money. When the Egyptians conquered Canaanite cities, they always recorded all of the booty from the city, including the grain. It also tells us that the harvest had just been taken in, as we read in the Bible. It was harvest time. These jars were full. They had just harvested their grain, and so this verifies the time of year that the attack took place. And finally, it tells us that the siege of the city was very short. They didn't need to use any of this grain for food because it was all over in 1 week. Didn't drag out for months or years as the Egyptian sieges of these strongly fortified Canaanite cities did. God was on the side of the Israelites, so they only needed a week. In the bulk, you can actually see some of these jars right there in the side of the excavation square, still there today, giving testimony to the truth of God's Word. And here's our scripture passage commanding the Israelites not to plunder Jericho. In Joshua 6, verses 17 through 19, they were commanded to take the silver, gold, bronze, and iron out of Jericho, but not for the people to keep, but to put in the treasury of the Lord. Of course, Achan disobeyed, and we know that led to a defeat in Joshua chapter 7, when they went up to Ai. There are a number of indications of harvest time. We talked about the jars full of grain, but also the fact that the stalks of flax were drying on Rahab's roof. You do that immediately after harvesting the flax. Also, the Israelites observed Passover, and that's in the spring of the year, again indicating that it was the early springtime and the time of harvest. And we talked about the siege being only 7 days. Well, finally, the question of how the walls fell. You've gotten my view on it. I think God used an earthquake, and other people have other ideas about that. I'm sure you've heard sermons on this where preacher said it was the sound waves from the trumpets and the shouting, or from the earth's vibration as the Israelites marched around. But the real answer is here in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 30, where it tells us, by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. It was the fact that the Israelites, in the face of this tremendous fortification system that was something beyond human capability to penetrate, they had faith to believe in God, faith to march around that city for those 7 days, and it was because of their faith that those walls came down. And so this is the lesson for us today, that when we face these impossible situations and these great high walls in our personal lives, if we'll trust the Lord, if we'll obey Him and do what He tells us to do, He will give the victory as He did to the Israelites in those days 3,400 years ago. Thank you for your attention.